Occasionally when games are localized for different regions, they'll have their names completely changed to fit the culture and regulations of that particular place. One such example is the 2006 open world game Bully, developed by Rockstar Vancouver. In this game you play as a troublemaking kid named Jimmy who's trying to survive in a boarding school that's infested with bullies. Rockstar already had a terrible reputation at this time, thanks to the various controversies surrounding their other games like Grand Theft Auto 3, Manhunt, and San Andreas. So before Bully even came out, there were already people who wanted the game banned. A lot of people figured the game was just a bullying simulator, but actually the game is more about stopping all of the jerks at the school. Nevertheless, the game had its name changed in some PAL regions from Bully to Canis Canum Edit, which means dog eat dog in Latin. Yet, no, Bully is just so simple, easy to remember, and highlights a big part of the game's story. Canis Canum Edit just sounds like a Final Fantasy character's name. If I had to use something other than Bully for the title, I probably would just use the name of the boarding school that the game takes place in, Bulworth Academy. That way the title is still in English, and it has something to do with the game's narrative, and it implies that this game takes place in a school. Another game whose name was changed due to moral concerns with the title of the game was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on the NES. Technically, despite being an American property, the game was released in Japan first, and its title roughly translates to Legend of the Radical Ninja Turtles. However, when the game made its way over to the UK, it was called Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. Strangely, the UK had a very odd aversion to the word ninja in the late 80s and early 90s. It had something to do with the violence and weaponry associated with ninjas, but long story short, it led to the ninja in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles being changed to hero. A similar thing happened with another classic 80s game for the NES, Ninja Gaiden. Its original title in Japan roughly translates to Legend of the Ninja Dragon Sword, and it was named Ninja Gaiden in North America, but in some parts of Europe it had its name changed to Shadow Warriors. These name changes aren't all that bad, they just seem kinda pointless. Now, I actually agree with the North American name change for the name of the Street Fighter Alpha series. The original Japanese name for the series was Street Fighter Zero. This never made sense to me as the Alpha series, timeline-wise, is set in between Street Fighter 1 and Street Fighter 2. Obviously, even games with numbers in their titles don't have to be chronological. Metal Gear Solid 3 takes place before Metal Gear Solid 1, but in this case, they deliberately use the number 0, and typically when you use a 0 in the title, it implies that this is supposed to be the beginning of the series, or at the very least, it takes place before 1 and 2. This gets even weirder when you get to the later entries in the Alpha series, Alpha 2 and Alpha 3, which were originally 02 and 03 in Japan. But the funniest one is easily an updated version of Street Fighter 02, called Street Fighter 02 Alpha. So they just used the North American title as a subtitle for a Japanese release. Street Fighter Alpha is one of the instances where I think changing the name was justified. Another Capcom fighting game series that I agree with having its name changed in the West is Darkstalkers. Darkstalkers was Capcom's second fighting game franchise after Street Fighter, where you get to play as a number of characters based on classic monsters and folktales like Frankenstein, Bigfoot, and Little Red Riding Hood. In Japan, however, the series is not called Darkstalkers, it's called Vampire. Yeah, just Vampire. Personally, I always thought this was a little boring, and sure, several of the most important characters in the series are vampires, but the cast includes tons of different monsters. Darkstalkers fits the collection of characters better and is just a more unique name. Now, you'd think that this was the end of the Japanese and American name differences, but oh no. Darkstalkers has easily the most confusing name choices of any game franchise ever. So, the first game in the series was originally called Vampire: The Night Warriors. Then, when it was released in the West, it was called Darkstalkers: The Night Warriors. Simple, right? But then, the next game in the series was called Vampire Hunter: Darkstalkers Revenge. Yeah, Capcom did the same thing they did with Street Fighter 02 Alpha. For some reason, they added the Western name for the series in the second game's subtitle. When Vampire Hunter was localized for North America and Europe, it was called Night Warriors: Darkstalkers Revenge. Revenge. So now, the subtitle for the first game is the title of the second game. The last in the trilogy of the arcade games was Vampire Savior, The Lord of Vampire. That's fine enough, I guess. But when the game was localized, they completely removed Darkstalkers from the title and stuck with the Japanese title, Vampire Savior. But to make things even more confusing, when the game was ported to the PlayStation, the localized name was changed to Darkstalkers 3. And I haven't even mentioned that Vampire Savior, aka Darkstalkers 3, got 2 updated ports in Japan called Vampire Hunter 2 and Vampire Savior 2. For the most part, the Japanese naming scheme is consistent. All of the games are called Vampire something, but in North America and Europe, you go from Darkstalkers to Night Warriors to Vampire Savior. It's a mess. If you want another series with a ton of regional name changes, look no further than the Kirby series. You'd think with a cute, non-controversial series like Kirby, there wouldn't be a ton of name changes, but boy, you'd be wrong. The first game in the series, Kirby's Dream Land, was originally called Kirby of the Stars in Japan. The next game in the series, Kirby's Adventure, was originally called Kirby of the Stars Fountain of Dreams Story. You can see that Japanese games like to get really wordy with their titles. The series' first outing on the Super Nintendo, Kirby Superstar, was originally named Kirby of the Stars Super Deluxe in Japan. The English title is certainly more compact, but I do love just tacking on random adjectives at the end of game titles, which is probably why I love Street Fighter so much. In Europe, the game is called Kirby's Fun Pack. To be fair, it makes sense considering Kirby Superstar is kind of like a collection of smaller adventures in one big package, though using pack without the C is a little jarring. Kirby Squeak Squad's original Japanese title roughly translates to Kirby of the Stars, They're Here, Doroche Gang. And in Europe, it's called Kirby Mouse Attack. I'm honestly not a fan of any of these titles, but if I had to pick one, I'd probably say I like Squeak Squad the best. Kirby's Return to Dreamland is just called Kirby of the Stars Wii in Japan, and Kirby's Adventure Wii in Europe. The Japanese and European names are just kinda boring. The North American one makes it seem like this is Kirby's big return to his roots, which it is considering Kirby finally had another home console adventure. The weirdest name change has to be for Kirby and the Rainbow Curse. In Japan, it's called Touch Kirby Super Rainbow, but in Europe, it's called Kirby and the Rainbow Paintbrush. I guess the word curse was just a bit too edgy for Europe. One of the most well-known series with regional name changes is Ratchet and Clank. Many of the original North American releases in the series had naughty innuendos as subtitles for their games, which were removed when the games were released in Europe and Japan. The second game in the series, Ratchet and Clank Going Commando, was called Ratchet and Clank Locked and Loaded in Europe and just Ratchet and Clank 2 in Japan. Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal was just called Ratchet and Clank 3 in Europe and Japan. Ratchet Deadlocked was called Ratchet Gladiator in Europe, and in Japan they put Clank back in the title and called the game Ratchet and Clank 4. The spin-off Ratchet and Clank Size Matters didn't get a name change in Europe, but in Japan its name was changed to Ratchet and Clank 5, Clash, the Miri Miri Army in the Dodeca Galaxy. Like I said, Japan, they tend to get a little wordy with their titles. If you want another example of that, look no further than Brain Age. Brain Age, Train Your Brain in Minutes a Day, was a really popular educational game for the DS released in 2005 in Japan and 2006 everywhere else. In Europe, it's called Dr. Kawashima's Brain Training, How Old Is Your Brain? Just about as long as the American title. But in Japan, the game is called Tohoku University Future Technology Research Center Professor and Supervisor Ryuta Kawashima's Train Your Brain DS Training for Adults. I do not know how they managed to fit all of that onto the box. Name changes are sometimes good, sometimes bad, and sometimes they're Brain Age.